So iPhone 15 season is basically over at this point. The dust has settled. And so why don't we talk about last year's iPhone? Because as much as there is a sizable demographic who rushes to buy the latest and greatest, there are also those who want to buy last year's phone for cheaper, especially considering nowadays year-over-year upgrades are very minor. And considering it's been a while since I've talked about the iPhone 14 Pro Max on this channel, I thought it was time for a long-term review on this phone after using it for over a year, so here are my thoughts on whether it's still worth buying. So if you want my honest thoughts on the iPhone 14 Pro, this might be the worst iPhone I've ever had, but iOS 17 might have just saved it. That really sums up my thoughts, and if you're curious about hearing more, let's dive right in and begin with the design. Design-wise, this phone has aged well in some aspects and hasn't aged so well in other aspects because on face value, this looks very similar to the latest iPhone. To most non-techies who don't pick up on the small details, the 14 and 15 Pro look near identical. The 15s might have slightly slimmer bezels, but it doesn't make a massive difference. And so considering this was the first iPhone to introduce the island, and this most likely will be a staple of newer iPhones for the foreseeable future like the notch was, the 14 Pro Max still looks fresh from the front. And by the way, would like to remind you guys, like this video and subscribe for more content like this, it would be appreciated. The back of the device also looks very similar to the 15 Pro's with its silky matte finish, and also has the same IP68 rating as the newest iPhone. Where it's not aged as well is really to do with the middle part of this phone, because this is officially the last Pro iPhone to include the ringer switch, use stainless steel, and include a lightning port. Now the lack of an action button is a non-issue because, don't get me wrong guys, a customizable button would be nice, but I can live without it. Now moving on to stainless steel, I won't lie to you guys and say, oh my god, stainless steel is so much better, because it isn't. In every aspect, titanium is an upgrade. The corners are much rounder, so it's much nicer to use in the hands, but more importantly, it's lighter, which makes a big difference. And I complained about the weight of this phone back when it released. Some glad apples resolved that, but as a result, the glossy and heavy stainless steel of this phone feels a little ancient, I can't lie, but it's not a deal breaker. What could be a deal breaker, however, is lightning. Now, I'm actually in the minority where I don't care about the USB-C ports. I know that people transfer large files off these Pro devices, but as I'll get to in a bit, I've never touched ProRAW or ProRes, and I'm sure 95% of consumers buying the 14 Pro also won't. And so when you're only going to be using it for charging, there's not a massive difference. I understand some want one port for all their devices, but I wirelessly charge my device most of the time anyways, and so if we ever get a portless iPhone, I actually wouldn't mind that because I rarely use the port on the iPhone. Also, I've seen a fair number of you guys in the comments mention that you would rather not switch to the iPhone 15 because you already have a plethora of lightning cables that could become redundant, and so that's a fair point to consider. And so overall guys, I don't think USB-C is a must-have feature for everyone. In fact, if you're on the market for a 14 Pro right now, there is a plus with this having the older lightning ports, and that's a fact it should depreciate even faster, which isn't great news for me because when I eventually sell this, I'm probably gonna have to sell it for a massive discount. But anyways, I'm already seeing the 14 Pro drop to under £800/dollars. Now let's move on to the display on the 14 Pro, and the great thing here is that guys, everything you're getting is on par with the 15 Pros. So it's the same 6.7 inch and 6.1 inch size options, it's OLED, it's got 120Hz, it's got 1000 nits of brightness for typical use, 1600 nits for HDR content, and a whopping 2000 nits of brightness outdoors. Now the brightness upgrade was the real game changer for me because with every iPhone before this, the display was not very visible outdoors, but you can clearly see everything with the 14 Pro outdoors. It does get warm to be fair when it's pumping out 2000 nits, but it doesn't overheat like I've seen some claim in the past. And overall guys, it's a joy to interact with this display. Now I know this has the always on display and I was excited about the iPhone gaining this at first, but that excitement came crashing down when I witnessed how much battery life I was losing because of this. And also I've seen some mention that already seeing burn-in issues after a year of using the AOD display, so yes, I've left this off and it's going to remain like that for the foreseeable future. Moving to performance, this is always the shortest segment of my reviews because I really have nothing to complain about here. iPhones have been fast for years. I know this can't run console level games like the A17 Pro can, but I don't care. I don't play games that often on my phone. The most demanding game I've ever played is Subway Surf, okay? And this basically runs every other game on the App Store perfectly fine. And so for 99% of consumers, A16 and 6 gigs of RAM is going to be plenty fine. I've had no RAM issues. Things stay in the background, and guys, I really have no complaints, as I said. I think my slight disappointment with the 14 Pro begins with the cameras, because while they're very good, I don't think Apple's fully utilizing the potential of the cameras. And a lot of my thoughts here are based on the fact I did recently use the iPhone 15, and that actually has inferior hardware compared to the 14 Pro with a smaller main sensor, but because Smart HDR5, the 24 megapixel modes, and auto portraits are such massive upgrades, that feels like the more polished experience. Now, don't get me wrong guys, I'm still overall happy with the cameras on this phone. The main camera is usually reliable and is great for taking pics of family and friends, but also recording footage for this channel. This has been the B-roll camera alongside the iPhone SE3. I also love the macro on this, and the 2x option has been a godsend. I usually forget the 3x is there because the 2x crop is so good with the main lens. However, I have two issues with the 14 Pro camera-wise. One is Smart HDR4, so basically, as others have reported, the 13 and 14 tends to occasionally overprocess images, so they can be a little iffy at times. It's not the biggest issue in the world, however. But number two, the focus distance with the main lens is so tight that even when I'm trying to get a close-up on an object, it straight up refuses to focus on it. Now the phone does usually switch to the macro when I try to get close up, but of course the ultra wide is inferior and you can see the drop in quality, so I just wish the main sensor could just do the close up shots. I could do this on older iPhones, and even the regular 15 with its smaller sensor can do this. And because there's not a massive difference when it comes to the quality between these sensors, I'd rather have the 15 sensor. Not only that, but as I said, the new software changes on the 15 do make a difference, and it's annoying the 14 Pro isn't getting any of these changes, even though the internals are exactly the same as the 15. I guess Apple would do anything to upsell consumers, but it does leave me a little underwhelmed with the camera experience on this iPhone. Now, if you're wondering about other camera features like night modes, night mode portraits, 4K cinematic modes, action mode, and portrait modes, these are all very nice to have and they do work as intended, and I do occasionally use them. What I've never touched, however, is ProRAW and ProRes. Especially with ProRes, it will take me ages to transfer the footage off my phone and the files would be unnecessarily massive for my needs, so I'm completely fine with the regular 4K footage on this phone. The front-facing camera was a big upgrade over older iPhones because it includes autofocus, and this makes a big difference. Again, as a content creator, I found I could finally use a selfie camera on this phone to record shorts because the quality was so excellent now, and the 15s do also have the same selfie lens, so this very much is one of the best selfie shooters on the market. And here's a video mic test for you guys with the front-facing camera. Let me know how this sounds and looks. It should be pretty crispy. You also get the same safety features as the newest iPhones, so that's crash detection and emergency SOS, and connectivity wise this phone has been solid. I've been getting full bars or close to that most of the time. Bluetooth has also been reliable and it does have the older Wi-Fi 6 tech, but guys, that's not a massive issue because Wi-Fi performance has also been great. Face ID has also worked reliable for me, and if you're wondering if the island makes it any faster, no, that's not the case. It works just as fast here as it did on older iPhones. Now, I do want to touch on the island here because my perspective on this feature has changed radically since the 14 Pro originally released. When this iPhone was first announced, I think Apple overhyped it a little and I got carried away thinking this would radically change the iPhone experience, but it didn't. However, Apple and developers are doing a pretty good job to make it more useful within iOS, and while I still don't think it's a must-have feature by any means, it certainly is nice to have because it does show you convenient information in the background, and is a visual upgrade compared to older iPhones. Now you may be wondering, everything so far doesn't sound too bad, so how is this the worst iPhone I've ever had? Well, it comes down to two things, the software and the battery life. So let's begin with the software, more importantly iOS 16. iOS 16 was a train wreck of an update, and I kind of feel bad for the 14 Pros because my experience would have been so much better if this launched with iOS 17, which has been super stable for me in comparison, but because it launched with iOS 16, I had numerous issues. There were times where the camera would freak out and it wouldn't let me use it till I reload the application. Sometimes the phone would refuse to wake up, and this was a thing that happened the most often, which was hella annoying. The phone would also occasionally freeze, which you would not expect from a high-end flagship device, and it clearly wasn't the chipset's fault because we know Apple's silicon is very powerful, so it's absolutely the software to blame for this. Now, I'm not going to pretend like I experienced some sort of bug every day, but it was definitely happening a lot more often with the 14 Pro Max compared to older iPhones I've had. In fact, I still vividly remember how incredibly stable the 13 Pro Max was. That phone never gave me an issue, and so to come from that to a phone that even occasionally freaks out was very disappointing. So yes, let me emphasize, it's not that this phone was unusable, most of the time it was completely fine, but the fact I was having these occasional instances throughout the last year where this phone would give up on me was hella annoying, especially considering the overall experience I've had with Apple devices in the past has been super stable. And it's not just me guys, iOS 16 was really a train wreck for most users. Now thankfully, as I said, iOS 17 has really fixed this phone. I never tried the beta, and so when I installed the public release, it did make this phone feel like a brand new device. Everything felt so much smoother, and apart from one bug I had initially that's now been fixed, this phone is finally the stable experience I expected from day one. However, there is one permanent consequence of bad buggy software, and that is subpar battery life. Now again, I must emphasize, I was coming from a 13 Pro Max, which consistently got me through the day with 30 to 40% left in the tank. It was incredible endurance, and so when I switched to this phone, I was kind of confused why I was getting worse endurance, even though this had a similar display size and a similar battery capacity. I did turn off the always on display because early on I did realize that would be a massive battery hog, and so really it comes down to iOS 16. In fact, I'm sure it's iOS 16 because battery life has been better for me with iOS 17, but the damage has been done. Since I was killing this phone a lot faster because of its worse endurance, the battery health really has dropped rapidly on this phone, and it's currently sitting at 90%, which is pretty bad. For comparison, my 13 Pro Max had 98% health a year later, and this was a massive controversy with the 14 Pros because many had noticed the battery health had dropped much faster on these phones compared to older devices, and I think iOS 16 and its bugginess is the main culprit. However, I wouldn't be put off this phone by what I said. The good news for those buying it right now is that you most likely are going to be using it with iOS 17 from day one, and so I can imagine battery life being very good on a brand new 14 Pro with the current stable build of iOS 17. And apart from the software and battery life, it's been a decent iPhone overall guys, and shares a lot of similarities with the much more expensive 15 Pro. So yes, if you find it for much less, definitely consider getting one. However, like I said in another video, I don't think you should overlook the regular 15s. I think the combination of the camera upgrades I previously mentioned, the much better battery life, and the USB-C ports could make it the better buy over the 14 Pro for some consumers, because in my experience it was ultimately the much more reliable iPhone. Anyways, let me know your thoughts in the comments, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and thank you for watching.